Good evening. As the mayor of Oak Harbor, it is my honor to welcome you to a regular meeting of the City Council. It is July 5th, 2017, 6 p.m., and I'd like to call the meeting to order. I'd like to invite you to stand and join us in an invocation. Tonight's is led by Pastor Quinn Snyder of Life Church, and I will follow that by leading the Pledge of Allegiance.
Hello, my name is Quinn Snyder, and it is my honor and privilege to be here with you all this evening. I would like to invite you to join me in prayer for this meeting and for our city. Let us pray. Dear Jesus, we thank you for this day and for this time to come together as leaders of our community. We ask for the wisdom and discernment to effectively make decisions as we shape the future of our city and of our community. Bless us with knowledge, wisdom, and creativity as we structure and plan for the things discussed here tonight. We ask that your hand of protection be with all the members of this city and of this council. Please bless each and every person here as the leaders commence with tonight's meeting. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Quinn. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, I think we have an absent council member. Councilor Campbell could not be with us tonight, so I would, yes.
I move we excuse Councilman Campbell for this evening.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Motion by Councilor Munn, second by Councilor Servadius to excuse Councilor Campbell from tonight's meeting. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. So our first item of business, actually, after that, is to approve our agenda. How would the council like to move forward? Any changes? Oh, yes, Councilor Umber.
Thank you, Mayor. I move that we accept the agenda as presented.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to accept the agenda as presented. Motion by Councilor Almberg, second by Councilor Munns. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, great. Item number 2, we are moving right along. I can see that item number 2B is under honors and recognition. We have our Police Chief Dresker with us tonight. Chief Dresker.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor and council members, thank you for taking some time with us today. If I could call Mike Clements, Officer Mike Clements up here. So here we're recognizing Officer Clements, Mike, for 20 years of service with the Oak Harbor Police Department. And I'd like to mention too that these recognitions, I know our officers enjoy them. They take pride in the fact that they mostly enjoy them. I think they take pride in the fact that they're being recognized. I know some locations, cities, and departments don't go through this type of a step quite formalized, so, and I appreciate it. Just a little bit about Mike. Mike's a very solid, dependable officer. Of course, he's been here 20 years. He lives a little ways away, but he's still here on time all the time, so that's to be commended. And Mike is one of our CISM officers, which is a Crisis Incident Stress Management team. So when there's a traumatic event, this small group of people is tasked with helping officers get through that or others get through those types of events. It's a real critical job. Luckily, it's not used too often in its most dramatic application. But that's it's even more important for them to stay current on it because of that. Mike is also EMT certified. How many years, Mike?
Last 7 years.
7 years, so he has that capability and takes care of our AEDs for us and does some other things for the department in addition to the normal patrol activities that he does. In fact, I had the honor and privilege November, I think, maybe December, when I first got here as a chief. I think Mike was one of my first recognitions, or was the first one, for a life-saving award for performing CPR, as I recall, on someone who survived that. So, we're here to recognize Mike. And I've got a fleece and a pin from the city for Mike's 20 years. He was hired on July 8th, 1997. Mike? council members are going to want to do the normal process, but I want to let Mike introduce his wife is here today, so I thought I'd let him introduce her.
My wife, Amy Clements, yeah, she's been with me pretty much the entire time. We've been married for 16 years this year, but we were together prior to that, so she's been witness to the entire transformation, as it were, and been one of the reasons I've been any form of success, so.
So, unless, if you guys want to come down, but I want to emphasize that Mike's minimizing that. The wives do a lot more than that. That we wouldn't be who we are without the wives. So I know he meant that, but I'm going to stress it.
Okay, we'll take 5-minute break, and
In yellow pants?
You were the one that made the fashion choice, right? Oh, Beth will cover him. There you go.
Thanks, Mike.
okay, we'll reconvene at this time, our July 5th regular council meeting. We are heading into our third section, citizen comment period. Citizens may comment on subjects of interest not listed on the agenda at this time, or items listed on the consent agenda. To ensure comments are properly recorded, please state your name clearly into the microphone. Please limit your comments to 3 minutes to ensure all citizens have sufficient time to speak. And I think we do, yes, we do have some comments tonight. And our first to sign up is Larry Minham.
Member.
Okay?
Hi, my name is Larry Memmer. I want to talk to you tonight about a need for a narcotics officer full-time for the city of Oak Harbor. Now, I understand that we had a narcotics officer, but when marijuana became legal, we kind of did away with that billet, and I think we really need to get it back. There's a big problem with not only in Oak Harbor, but Island County and Washington State and other states with heroin and meth. I personally had heroin and meth in my front yard by a drug user that lived down the street. Somebody bought from that house, and the police were coming, and so they dropped it by the sidewalk and got arrested on second. But I picked it up and gave it to the officer. But it's everywhere, and they're blatant. They do it out in front, out in the open. We've been fighting at Northeast 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and Queets. We've been fighting 4 drug houses for the last 2 years. We've taken over 30 license plate numbers of meth users, drug users. We've taken photos. We've taken time slots of when they showed up and when they left. And we turned it all over to the police department. Well, within 2 years of doing all this, we haven't really seen much change in the area of drugs. The new police captain assigned Tony Schlowick to the case, and he has done more in 2 months than anybody else at the police department, along with the help of a couple of council members that have helped out getting that started for us. So, you know, you look at the crime around Oak Harbor, you look at the break-ins, you look at, you know, a lot you can relate to the drug issues that we have. And unfortunately, the police department don't have a one-person that's going to track drug use throughout Oak Harbor and work with other agencies to do it. They're all reacting to whatever situation happens because they don't have that one officer that's all they do. They'll buy drugs. They'll do whatever they have to do to get them off the streets, hopefully to get them help. Now for Northeast 3rd, luckily, maybe unluckily, our person is in the hospital at Harborview. But since they've been gone in Harborview, we have not had one person, other than today, I saw a guy walking down the street that didn't belong in our neighborhood. And he stopped at one of the drug houses and knocked at the door, but they weren't home. So I know that he's probably going to buy drugs or give them drugs to sell, I don't know. But if we had one police officer that could get back onto the drug issue of Oak Harbor, I think we'd see a lot of crime go down and our neighborhoods would be safe again. So this is 4 blocks of people that, you know, we've been fighting and working together, and now we started a neighborhood watch. My time up? But I think it's a real issue that you really need to take a look at and come to an agreement that, yeah, we do have this problem and we do need to fund somehow the police department with a full-time narcotics officer. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is Robin Gahn.
That's all right. My name is Robin Gahn. There we go. I'm just going to reiterate a little bit about what Mr. Member has said. The 2 years that grandchildren cannot ride their bikes down the street, the 2 years of 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, we see the garage open, the garage shut, and we all know what's happening. The 2 years of submitting any and all information under the see something, say something, and through the lack of resources, nothing has transpired. It really needs to be addressed. I'm not sure how to add it into the budget. Obviously, that's something for the council to decide. It's our understanding that the budget has already been set for the next 2 years, but there has to be a way. There just has to be a way for our kids, for our adults, because the people we are dealing with are not kids. These are people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s that are doing this. So it is not only impacting their lives and diminishing, but everybody else around us. When the kids can't play, when the people see it blatantly out in public, we need to be involved a lot more. So hopefully take our information into consideration very deeply, because people of Oak Harbor need it and they deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gahn. Maria Clements? Maria Clements? Oh, okay. Tony Pop. I know Tony's here. Hi, Tony.
Hi, thank you. Tony Pop, and I live on Northeast First Avenue. I've lived there for over 30 years, and today I went for my first, with this group of neighbors of mine, representing 4 or 5 blocks, to my first neighborhood watch meeting with Police Officer Slowick. My kids have gone to Olympic View. There's a park there at the corner. One of the questionable houses that's next to that park and across the street from Olympic View. We need to be concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Priscilla Valentine.
Hello, I'm Priscilla Valentine, and I'm here with the rest of the neighborhood. I live on Queet Street, and we have been observing a lot of activity for the last 4 or 5 years. We have called the police several times of encampment in backyards, and unfortunately, we can't do anything about it. If they have the permission of the parents, it's fine, because I've been down here and talked to one of the employees downstairs. We had an incident here about a week and a half ago where we had a young lady standing on the corner of 2nd and Queets. About 6 o'clock in the morning, she was there and she was on her cell phone. By a little after 7 o'clock, she was standing, or weaving, I should say, by the stop sign. Well, anyway, I called the police department, and they said that they would send somebody down there. They wanted me to give a description. I thought, well, I don't really want to go outside and let them know what I'm doing, but I did anyway. Well, anyway, when I left, because I had an appointment, the police hadn't arrived. One of our neighbors, he watched for it, and nothing happened. Well, anyway, apparently afterwards, the sergeant came. There was nothing to see, so he left. So I went down to the police station, and I asked to speak to the chief of police. And I ended up getting an acting captain instead. I really wanted to talk to the chief of police. Until just now, I didn't even know what he looked like. My fault, I guess. But anyway, we've had things going on in our neighborhood for the last 4 or 5 years. We had the corner of 4th and Queets. We had something like 18, 19 people living in a house, and the only reason why they got into it is they had a problem with the plumbing, and everything happened. They had a great big arrest down there. They got the house cleaned out. Now we have it on the corner of 1st and Queets. My neighbor across the street has little kids, and she lived in that house when she was young. She came back to it as a married woman with children. She has to be observant at all times. With other neighbors in the neighborhood, and the same thing happens. Down on the corner of 4th and Queets, the other day we had a campfire going, or whatever. They burnt rubbish. One of the neighbors called the police or the fire department about it. We've got rats, and I'm sure everybody's got it here who lives in the city limits. We're trying to keep it control, and it's not working. I realize that there's budgets and all that, but I'm with Larry and Robin. We need a narcotics officer to see if this can happen. I've had it firsthand, 3 of my children on meth. All 3 of them right now, thank God, are off of it. But I've seen what it can do to a family, and I can see what it can do to a neighborhood. So please, with this, all of us coming down here and talking, see if there's any way that you can squeeze a narcotics officer in the budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else for citizen comment? Whoops, sorry about that. I guess the time was up.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Thank you very much for coming tonight, and we'll talk to the chief and follow up as best we can. Okay, I think that ends our citizen comment period for tonight, and we are on to the consent agenda. Items are considered to be routine. I want to know if anybody has any concern about any of the items on the consent agenda. If not, we'll move forward and approve them as presented. Seeing none, I think we are now quickly on to item number 5, which is the mayor, council members, and the city administrator comment time. I have a couple of comments. I wanted to make sure and recognize Christmas in July. North Whidbey Help House will be celebrating its 40th anniversary. Aha, there it is in the paper. This is on July 7th from 3 until 6 p.m. with a special ceremony at 4:30 to kick off for the next 40 years. So I can't believe it's been 40 years. That's fabulous. There's also the Christmas in July Food and Fun Drive that will take place on Saturday, July 15th at 10 a.m. It'll start at 10 a.m. and run until 2 p.m. Volunteers will be at Walmart, Safeway, Hagen's, and SARS Marketplace. So please help the Christmas in July Food and Fun Drive that will take place on Saturday, July 15th. Congratulations are in order. In fact, I saw him here earlier during the employee recognition, in order for Sergeant Mike Bailey, who was selected to fill the vacant police captain position. That was effective July 1st. And under the personnel order, our chief Dresker presented on July 28th regarding the selection of Captain Mike Bailey. I'll just read it. It's brief. It says, after a competitive selection process with applications from across the country, Sergeant Mike Bailey has been selected to fill the vacant captain position with the Oak Harbor Police Department. Mike has been in the acting captain position since January of this year and has been with the Oak Harbor Police Department since 1995. Chief Dresker says he has every confidence Mike will do a great job and be integral in working with him as chief and our quality employees as we continue moving our department forward. The effective date is July 1st, with a promotion ceremony to take place at a later date to be announced soon. Mike's radio call sign will be updated to Ocean 2. So please join in congratulating Mike Bailey in his selection as captain. We have some updates here at City Hall. You'll notice if you look around that our hallways and offices have received a much-needed new coat of paint. The painter is Pat Shelley, who most of us have seen painting around Oak Harbor for years. He comes back and paints even though he's pretty much retired from his normal business. He works for us often in the summers. We've also replaced some of the light diffuser panels here in the council chambers. You can see that they all look the same color now, and they're so far anyway all in one piece and not cracked and faded like they were. Rich Tiehouse and Tom Wade have made that happen. They take great care of the city buildings, including selecting and installing the new artwork hanging system, which is just behind me here along the wall. This will alleviate the need to paint and repaint the wall after many talented artists have shared their work with us. Tonight's artwork actually, or what you're seeing behind me is the artwork of Karen Leeds Photography in Freeland, Washington. Karen says, the challenge of any artist is to bring the image held in mind into the reality of form. When the mind's eye and the final result are one, the artist is successful. I am drawn to the play of light and shadow, to textures, patterns, and shapes, how they work together and enhance each other. I'm much more interested in the micro world than the wide panoramas, and although many of my images are of Whidbey Island, they aren't necessarily recognizable as such. My work has been shown at the Greenbank Farm Sunday Market, Friends of Freeland Benefit Art Sale, Whidbey Working Artist Studios, and this list goes on and on. She is a member of the Whidbey Island Camera Club and Whidbey Allied Artists, and she has participated in many of the group's shows. I currently have work on display at Gordon's Restaurant in Freeland. To see a more complete portfolio, one can access my Facebook page. So it's Karen Leeds Photography, and it's in Freeland, Washington. So I think with that, my comments are, I did want to make one more comment. You know, our SAR did just another rescue, and the interesting thing about that was they were called to the Okanagan Pacific Crest Trail, and on the way noticed a person in the water just east of by Deguala Bay, just east of Whidbey Island. They actually noticed a distressed person on the way. They rescued that person, and then were still able to get to Okanagan and rescue the initial person that they had been called to rescue. And they printed their numbers of rescues, and I think I mentioned at a earlier meeting this year that they do over 20% of the rescues in our country. The NAS Whidbey SAR group. So we are lucky to have them as neighbors and friends, and they keep our people safe around this region, and it's a wonderful asset. So thank you again to the SAR people in NAS Whidbey. With that, I'm going to turn it to council for council comments. And yes, Councilor Watsinger.
I'd like to just thank the chamber and all of the business sponsors, everyone that collaborated to put on our 4th of July celebration yesterday. It was the parade and the fireworks and the carnival. My family and I took it all in, and it was wonderful. We had a great time. So thank you for another successful 4th of July. It's one of my favorite celebrations in this city, and it's probably one of the most fun things that I get to do as a council member, to be a part of the parade. So thank you to everyone who helped put that on yesterday. And then the chamber's going to follow it up just this Saturday with a fun crab cakes and cocktails event in Flintstone Park from 4 to 7. That's this Saturday, the 8th. So maybe I'll go check that out too. Sounds exciting. And I'd also like to thank, I know that the citizens that commented left, but I want to thank them for coming as a group and highlighting an issue that they're having in the city. We can't, sometimes we don't know what's going on, and it's really helpful for me to hear that, and I thank them. And I'm glad that I got to listen and take in an issue that they're having in our city. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too had great time and fun yesterday celebrating birthday of America. I would like to thank our lady chauffeur who drove us on the trunk. Her name is Karen. She's one of the many volunteers from the Rotary and Chamber of Commerce. And also would like to thank the police department. They were very visible yesterday, directing traffic, walking, riding their bicycle during the parade. And after the parade, I saw them walking and riding the bicycle on the park, making us safe in the park during the fireworks. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Councilor Munns.
I'll add my kudos for the whole fireworks. There's a reason why Oak Harbor got rated as one of the 10 best in the country for an old-fashioned 4th of July. So well deserved for all the volunteer stuff. I'd like to challenge the council to come up with 40-something for Help House. I don't care if it's 40 cans, 40 pennies, $40, $400, but this really is an important birthday, but unfortunately, the need is not going to go away, and the numbers keep going up. I've been serving on that board since January of 1996. So I have seen the difficulties, and at times our director has not gotten a paycheck. We didn't know this as a board member to make sure everything else was paid and we had enough money for food. So anything you can donate will be much appreciated, and also to our community. They've always come through when there's been a real need, and this is something important, and our community should be proud because it's not based on government subsidies. This is a community action, and it's something that they've done. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. Nice job. Councilor Servadius.
Thank you, Mayor. I too will reiterate, a great day yesterday, excellent parade, long parade. But it was an excellent parade, and I wanted to just give another shout out to the chamber. We had a party at our house last night. We watched the fireworks, and the folks are commenting on what a great city production. And the reality is, as we've said, but I want to make it perfectly clear, it's the fireworks are privately donated, and all that production takes place because of the chamber. And a shout out, obviously, to Woodby Coffee, who's the primary sponsor of that, or one of the major donors, and has been for many years. So thank you again to the chamber for all they do. I want to say thank you to the folks, I wish they would have stayed, that chose to show up and participate in our process and let us know. I know that not that long ago there was a problem house on Midway Boulevard, and had some conversations, and that house has now since been turned over and it's being renovated. It was a drug concern. And so I know that we can make progress there. Mayor, I would suggest, I know we talked at one point, and I don't know if you gave specific instructions to the chief or not, but the school, during school opening and closing times, the police have a very strong patrol presence around the schools, especially around the elementaries, which I very much appreciated. I'll often do a carpool and drop my kids off, and you see that increased presence during the morning hours and the afternoon hours. And since school is out, we might have a little free time there that those officers could patrol other areas, and hopefully that presence will encourage some of these folks to, maybe it's a strong statement, but as I think it was Larry Memmer said, you know, first and foremost, let's get those folks some help, but if we can't get them help, let's encourage them to conduct those activities in Skagit County, no, somewhere else, but not here. So hopefully we can get those folks help, but I appreciate the folks that showed up and spoke this evening. And that's it at the moment. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Councilor Heisen.
I'm going to expand on that, the Neighborhood Watch group that came to speak. I think their neighbors are fortunate to live in an area with such a vigilant Neighborhood Watch group, so that's encouraging. I did want to say that Island County Human Services does have an opioid outreach worker full-time. She's embedded with the sheriff, Island County Sheriff. That is all she does. And there are grant opportunities for another opioid outreach worker, and I work at Island County Human Services during the week, so it's my day job. And so I've been approached a couple of times saying, you know, would Oak Harbor be interested in having someone like this that would be funded and staffed by Island County, I believe, if we are able to apply for a grant and get that. And it's primarily based on getting people help. I mean, you know, our officers, they know who everybody is and who needs help, and they'll go in, you know, with the officer, establish a relationship with these people so that they're not afraid to talk about getting help and et cetera. And they've really, really made a lot of headway. So I think that if the opportunity comes up to team up with Island County on getting an opioid outreach worker embedded here with the OHPD, even on a part-time basis, that would be really beneficial to us. And it sounds like there's definitely a need. So I'm not sure what the PD or the mayor's position on that is, but it's an option.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I'll get you more info if you want it.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you very much. I would like that, and the chief and I will be talking certainly about tonight's discussion. Okay. Seeing no other council, we will move on to the city administrator, Dr. Merriman.
All right, thank you, Mayor. A couple of items tonight are scheduled this month in July 26th. Is our next workshop meeting. We'll have a couple of action items on that one, but that's our remaining meeting for this month. I also as well wanted to say a lot of thanks to city staff. You know, there's a lot of work that goes into the 4th of July event, and we get to see some of our staff out on the street patrolling, or they're in the parade, or they're doing different things. I believe there's an equal or greater number even that are behind the scenes that you don't get to see, that are doing things in the planning stage or doing traffic control, different things like that. So thank you to everybody. It's, I think, one of the premier days in our community where everybody gets that really good sense of home, and a really a good event, and it's really appreciated. One other thing that we rolled out today officially, thank you to Ms. Tesh helping me on this, but the city administrator's report that we've done by paper, and that today we launched it out using our new software, which is really amazing. It helps us get that out, and we have some other things we can move into as far as social media and those things if we want to take a look at that. But check your email today. We sent the report out. It's also smartphone compatible, so it should show up pretty well on your phones. So thank you to Nikki for working on that and putting that together. And we'll be sending that on a recurring basis to keep staff and everybody up to date on things that are going on in the city. And on that note, I'll hand this off to Brett to give us an update on the clean water facility.
Well, good evening. It's time for our Clean Water Facility Project update. You know, lately, for last year, we've been watching concrete and mortar and masonry units. And the thing we don't realize is treatment plants are a lot of equipment. And we're entering a phase now where equipment is starting to show up. I was out Friday and this thing showed up, and I was going, what we're doing with a chemical tank, it's a hypochlorite tank, and it's time to start doing that kind of thing. So we're actually moving into a very interesting phase. The masonry is going up very quickly, and we're starting to think about filling it full of machinery. This little device here looks like a piece of pipe, but actually it's a flow meter, and that's about a $40,000 unit. Either that's an effluent flow meter or a RAS flow meter, so we're starting to see these kind of things showing up. So it's kind of the more interesting part of these things. We're getting past the structural part and into the actual mechanical electrical systems, which is the heart of our treatment plant. Recent activities, we did receive our 60% Windjammer plans in late June. We are continuing to work on SCADA software development. We're actually starting to buy hardware for that. We did meet with the Arts Commission and prepared a listing of possible art piece locations. We have 16 of them identified where we can provide the infrastructure, so more to come on what we actually want to do there, but we're starting that type of coordination. Construction, excuse me, we continue placing concrete on GMP's number 7. Number 7 is all done. Number 8, and actually we've started number 10 now. So the self-performed work, we're hanging in there. We're still ahead of schedule, under budget. We're clearing up number 7 right now. It's looking pretty good. We continue to backfill around the structures, so our sheet piles have now disappeared. The big gaping hole is no longer there. We are continuing the mechanical, electrical parts that I showed you earlier, and that's going to be more important. This month we were up to 90 workers on site. We're expecting to go to 100 next month. We'll probably peak out about 110. And we, as you can see, we're the above grade masonry work. It continues. They are working they're way ahead of schedule on that, so that's pretty exciting. We did discover additional human remains in the last couple of weeks. Our MOA was very successful in that process. It's always a stress on us, but we're keeping it down, and it has not created impacts on us. So kudos for the team and for our archaeologists. And I have to compliment our MOA partners, the tribes and DAP. They've been very helpful in this and done a good job of minimizing the impacts to us. Funding, I'm not sure where the SRF allocation is. That was in the state budget package, so that got passed, so we'll find out more about that pretty soon. And we are pursuing Windjammer Park funding opportunities. It's going to be kind of slow for the next couple months. We hope to give you a presentation of the 60% Windjammer Park design at one of the workshops, probably in late July, if we can pull it all together. One thing we'll be talking about in probably the August meeting is we have to buy an asset management software system for the new facility, and so we're going to proceed with that purchase here pretty soon. Schedule-wise, we just reviewed what we call Oak Harbor 32, our big schedules that cover the wall, and right now we're looking good, keeping on schedule, and we're still looking at startup in July of next year, starting to put sewage to it. Public outreach, if you want to find out more information about the project, you can reach us at oakharborcleanwater.org. You can call us at 914-7000 or our business extensions. Email us at treatmentplant@oakharbor.org. And we have another drop-in meeting planned for next Monday on the 10th. Questions?
Any questions, input? Oh, Councilor Munns.
This asset software you
Uh-huh.
talked about that we need to purchase,
Yeah.
has that kind of already been figured out roughly,
In
the
terms of-
cost?
Yeah.
Or it'll be something added new to it?
It's already
Okay.
it's built into it, yeah. But it's just we haven't executed a contract for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, thank you, Mr. Arvidsson. Nice report. And that concludes, okay. So we are now on to item number 6. We have a couple of ordinances now to discuss, and I'll give an opportunity to the public to speak. And it says to speak during a scheduled public hearing or meeting, please sign in on the sheet provided. And even if you decide that you want to come up during the time, that would be fine. To ensure comments are recorded properly, please state your name clearly into the microphone and limit your comments to 3 minutes to ensure all citizens have sufficient time to speak. And our ordinance number 1801, amending Oak Harbor Municipal Code, Title 20, updating the City of Oak Harbor critical area regulations. And I think we have our senior planner, Dennis Lefebvre.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, Dennis Lefebvre, Senior Planner. Tonight represents possibly and hopefully the last step for this critical areas ordinance. It's been before you several times, so I'll kind of keep my comments at a higher level so we won't get into a lot of detail this evening. But what prompted this whole effort was RCW 3670A, which requires that the city periodically review and revise, if needed, our development regulations to ensure that we remain consistent with our comprehensive plan and in conformance with state law. As you know, we adopted our comp plan back in June of last year, which was really the mandated timeline that we needed to have our development regulations updated at the same time, but the automatic extension offered by the state for 1 year was accepted by the council, so that gave us another year until the end of last week, basically. So what we are doing as part of our development regulations is looking at our critical areas ordinance. It's a big effort put on with a lot of focus at the state level. As I mentioned in previous meetings, there are 5 mandated critical areas that we look at. It's critical aquifer recharge areas, frequently flooded areas, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, geologically hazardous areas, and wetlands. What we have done with the City Council is we've presented back in April kind of a history of critical areas in the City of Oak Harbor. We did a definition of the critical areas in conformance with how the state has defined all of them. We identified some of the key areas that we were going to expect to change because of the most recent studies that have been produced by the state. And we also handed out a conformance document with our comp plan to show exactly how we're going to be in conformance with the comp plan and implement the goals and policies in the comp plan. At your May workshop, we presented the best available science. What we use to create our development regulations needed to be based on the best available science. So we went through an exercise which showed what were some of the references that we used to update our code. And we also handed out a first draft of the ordinance. Then at our June workshop, which was just last week, we actually produced a second draft of the ordinance. We also gave you a document that referred to all of the changes between the first and second draft of the ordinance. And we had an Exhibit A, which we talked about, which dealt with stormwater and steep and unstable slopes. That's been incorporated into the ordinance that you have tonight. The Planning Commission has also done a lot of work on this effort. As you can see, there's been 4 meetings that we've had with the Planning Commission to walk through basically the same items that I just discussed with you and get their input. They had their public hearing back in June of 27th, which is last Tuesday evening, and had sent to you a unanimous recommendation for approval. As with any code amendment, we need to do our procedural steps, and we've done all of those with this code update. We produced a non-project State Environmental Policy Act determination of non-significance. We issued that in April. We met the Department of Commerce 60-day notification of an intent to adopt development regulations. We did that in early May 2nd actually. We produced the draft ordinance and put it on the web page so that folks can have an opportunity to take a look at it. We also did that in May as well. I mentioned the Planning Commission public hearing, which is required according to the Municipal Code. It was legally notified. I shared with you the recommendation that has come forward to you. And tonight is the last step. It's before you for the optional public hearing and for your decision. So with that, my comments are complete, but I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Lefebvre. I think at this time we'll open it up to for public comment. And I see that we've got Mr. Hovey, Hal, that would like to comment at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My name's Hal Hovey. I'm a member of the Planning Commission and a resident here in Oak Harbor. As Dennis said, we did unanimously vote to move the ordinance forward to City Council last week, the Planning Commission. I would like to note, however, that the draft 2 of the ordinance that came before us last week had some significant changes which I have huge concerns about. I raised them at the meeting last week. I understand we're under a timeline deadline that we have to get this regulation out because we're already in a 1-year, grace period, if you will, or extra period. But there are a lot of buffer zone changes that have changed substantially. For example, a Category 1 wetland, the worst case condition buffer has gone from 200 feet to 300 feet. Even the least impactful wetland and the lowest, damage or impact zone has changed from 25 feet to 40 feet. We've got lots that are 50 feet wide. If you change from 25 to 40 feet, it's potential to affect those lots for development. My concern that I would like the council and the mayor to consider for action is we had a huge discussion back in December about the low impact development regulations that were pretty much forced down our throat by the state. It's really time, we're at the tipping point where these regulations and these ordinances that are being passed are affecting the ability of people in the city to do things that they want to do. I'm really concerned with that. Yes, I voted to send it forward because I feel like we're under a state deadline to do so, but I think that we need to go back to the state and see if we can get some relief. Some of the things that put us under the low impact development rules, as Mr. Allenberg so eloquently talked about back in December, we need to appeal those. We need to do whatever is necessary to go back and say, this should not apply to an environment where we don't get 40 inches of rain. It shouldn't apply just because we have a military base within our city limits. The part that's within the city limits doesn't even have airplanes on it anymore. It hasn't had for many decades. So anyway, that's the point I'd like to make is that yes, we sent this forward, but there are some very deep concerns that we have, that I at least have about this particular ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levy. Anyone else? Citizen comment period. I guess then at this time we'll close citizen comment and bring it back up to council here. Councilor Heisen.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Dennis. Just so I have this clear, there was a draft approved by the Planning Commission that has since changed, and it is not the draft approved by the Planning Commission? What changed and when?
No,
And why?
the only change was we added Exhibit A, which was distributed at the workshop last Wednesday.
Okay.
That was also a part of the Planning Commission recommendation, was to include Exhibit A.
So the version we are looking at was approved by the Planning Commission?
Yes.
Okay. The impact footage, the 25 to 40 feet, the 200 to 300, why were those changes made? That was based on what exactly?
Yeah, that's a very good observance by Mr. Hovey.
He's an observant guy.
They were significantly increased, and that boils down to the best available science. And I actually initially proposed smaller buffers to the Department of Ecology, but they say that wouldn't protect the values of the habitat and the functions of the wetland properly. It wouldn't reflect the best available science. So she came back, she being Diane Hennessy, with their recommended buffers for the city of Oak Harbor, which we've incorporated into this ordinance to meet the best available science requirement.
Okay, so those numbers weren't pulled out of the air. They were recommended by the Department of Ecology?
Strongly recommended, I'll add.
Got it. Okay. I hear you loud and clear there. Strongly recommended. Okay. And make sure I covered everything I wrote down here. Okay, it's good to note that those changes that were made weren't arbitrary, but I mean, I think we're all in agreement with Mr. Hovey that we need to do what we can to try and appeal that, our qualifying for the criteria for LID. So, and that's something that we talk about every time it comes up, but just as a note to myself, if we could pursue that, remind us, tell us what we need to do and who we need to talk to make our case. If there's anything we can help do, please let me know. We can, fight that ongoing. But for now, if this is what's recommended and approved by the Planning Commission, then I'll support it. But I think we need to stay vigilant.
If I may, for the record, is to add a discussion briefly on a section that we have in Title 2012, which is kind of the general regulations overseeing all the critical areas. Mm-hmm. There's a section in there that deals with reasonable use. And if any of these critical areas basically strip the land of any development potential, there's a method that we can engage to allow development on that parcel. So as Mr. Hovey mentioned, with the increase in buffers, that might take theoretically the use of an entire parcel away. But there's a section in our code that allows us some flexibility to allow that property owner to develop.
Okay, so there is a process.
Yes.
An appeal process, for lack of a better.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Councilor Munt.
This Title 2012, there's no guarantee, though, that the developer might not lose a whole parcel. There's a little wiggle room, but you didn't sound very convinced that
the fine line
you
is
could do
a
it,
takings
so.
issue. We can't take the economic use of a property from through development regulations from a property owner. Am I stating that incorrectly, Mr. Powers?
Excellent question, Mrs. Munns, but actually, Mr. Lefevre is correct. The reasonable use exceptions in the code are there specifically to prevent a regulatory takings, which of course is unconstitutional. So there's also another step in there as well, which is particularly for wetlands that Mr. Hovey expressed concern about. There are a couple of techniques. One's called buffer width averaging, which is pretty common. So it's not a uniform buffer around a wetland. It allows us to think of it as squeezing a balloon. So when you squeeze a balloon and make it skinnier in one part, it'll get larger in another part. It's a very common technique to make the buffer fit with that particular piece of property. But when all else fails, you go through the reasonable use exceptions specifically to prevent irregulatory takings.
Follow-on question. Dr. Merriman, I believe you or someone was working with a very knowledgeable person that knew that we didn't fit the parameters we're being put in. And they were trying to help with DOE to get us out of that. Do you know where we are on it? Because they clearly had the evidence that we don't get the rainfall, we don't have the type of soil, we don't have this, we don't have this, and yet because of over 20,000, we are being crammed in with Olympia and some other places. So I thought staff had found some interested ears that were willing to work with us to restate our case, not just staff but through the legislation or other things that we don't fit that category, we shouldn't be there. Do you know where we are on that?
These are two separate, do you mind?
Go ahead.
These are two separate issues altogether, Mrs. Munns. So the one that has been subject of council conversation for many months is the low impact development and the amount of rainfall that Oak Harbor would get relative to, say, Seattle or Olympia. The code that's before you this evening has nothing to do with low impact development. It is purely about critical areas as defined by the Growth Management Act and by the state of Washington. And those were the 5 critical areas that are listed in your agenda bill. So they're totally separate. I won't even try to draw a picture for you there. So you have steep slopes, you have wetlands, you have the fish and wildlife habitat, et cetera. Those are the things which are critical areas. Low impact development is an entirely separate topic altogether.
Then I guess when you said fish. So they stopped construction on a outfall on Scenic Heights because the salmon might swim up it, and it's what, a 200, 150-foot drop cliff? And DOE stopped us because the salmon might jump that high and swim in it? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, didn't something like that happen? And I'm not sure where we are. I mean, you just mentioned critical areas.
Yeah.
They decided that was a critical area. And I'm sorry, that's just asinine to think a salmon's going to jump 150, 200 feet up that bluff to get to where this water just is draining off.
So I can see where these things could potentially sort of weave together from a council perspective. That too is a separate issue, and that's
But
really.
isn't that part of the critical, I mean, to me, it's connected to critical area. Yes, this is ordinance that we have to pass, but
So
I'm exasperated.
Well, as is staff, I mean, there's regulation, and then there's how are those regulations applied, and clearly they're not always applied in a fashion which we think would be a common sense approach. So that particular problem that you've pointed out, we won't throw ecology under the bus. That's Fish and Wildlife that has that particular viewpoint, and that's whether or not something is a drainage ditch or is it a stream. But your underlying comment, I think, is a great one, which is that there are a lot of environmental regulations that we are obligated to adhere to. And one of the things that Dennis mentioned early on in his presentation was the concept of best available science. We are required by the state law to base our regulations on best available science. As a smaller jurisdiction, we lack the ability, the funding ability, to pay for our own original science. And so our only recourse really is to fall back on the science which is published by the state agencies. And so when ecology recommends to us a particular buffer width, it's because it's based on the best available science that has been put together at the state level. Now, we have the option of doing our own science, but we can't afford to undertake that level of scientific review. And so the recommendations are really more than that. They are pretty prescriptive in terms of what we need to do. Our relief, then, is how does it fit on an individual piece of property and those two code provisions that I spoke to earlier. So there's an underlying theme in that these current topics that you have been talking about are related to our environment. Those two things just don't happen to be part of the critical areas code that's before you this evening.
But the critical code affects some of that stuff. Okay.
There are certainly relationships, yes. But what we're doing this evening is trying to complete that last step of making sure we're compliant with the Growth Management Act. And then that does not prevent us from continuing to follow up with the state agencies as the staff has already committed on the LID and the rainfall topic. Again, two separate things altogether.
Thank you.
And
Merriman?
Mayor, if I might add in, whenever there's a question out there, I don't like to leave them hanging like that. And I know Mrs. Munns isn't the only one that's wondering as far as the LID issue and where that's at right now. We did work with two different Senate offices here during this last session, Senator Fortunato and Senator Bailey's office, and they were working together to a degree to see about even sponsoring a bill and getting that groundwork laid out. There are some procedural things we need to do with the Department of Ecology, and Senator Bailey, now that the session is done, she's been working with my office and we'll be coordinating how we're going to forward that approach. And that addresses the issues as far as our site-specific things, like rainfall and those things like that, to see if we can get those crafted into a bill and get that forward to see if we get some relief from that. So that's where that's at this time. I think everybody would like some of these things to be done now, but we're kind of at the whim a little bit of the legislature on getting that rule change made, but we are working on that.
I'm not trying to be up on staff, and I know you're beating your head against the wall because you haven't figured out a way to get in right language that they'll say yes. It just fries me that unfunded mandates that doesn't fit us, and yet we're required to do it because it's the law, and we're a small community and we don't have the resources to, as we know, they can come up with their own best science, and they really don't have best science, they just call it that. we've run into that with the marina and the fish like light or don't like light. But it just seems a shame that we have someone that decides they can make us do what they want. And it's just a shame when everyone works so hard. So I commend the staff. I know you're working really hard, and people have gone and gotten beat up because they ask questions and at the exception, you know, and I've seen it on their face, and I know that, and I appreciate it. It's just, anyway, thank you.
We had an extensive conversation at the department head meeting this morning about the outfall, and I'm convinced that our staff is communicating as well as they can be with that with the various departments. I had the same concern and voiced it at the meeting about the outfall, and my vision was that the state's concern was fish going into that, which all of us know cannot happen. However, there are potentially concerns about whether the water that gets down to the outfall is affected by habitat, and so that is upstream, that is in the areas that are draining. However, having said that, the Department of Ecology will be here in the next week to, or I think it's Fish and Wildlife. Our engineer Stoll is meeting with them, and so we're proceeding ahead on that. So. I see Mr. Stoll back there, but I think I think staff is all over that, believe me. So, Councilor Servadius?
Sure, thank you. Mr. Lefevre, when this was presented to us at our workshop here, recently is the one I remember the most. It was presented as mostly housekeeping, wordsmithing, updating definitions, and the first big chunk of this is definitions. It's interesting, I don't know if interesting is the right word. We've had a year extension, which we've just exceeded, and most of these meetings have occurred in about the last 60 days. So the concerns that Mr. Hovey raised that I'm looking at, and a couple things that jumped out at me, they're probably going to sound very similar, and my concern is, or my comment is, well, I'll start with this. What if we don't make a few of these changes? I was going to start off by asking you, is this in general more restrictive or less restrictive? But I think we see it's a lot of housekeeping, but there is in essence more restrictions that are, would you agree that it's more restrictive than less restrictive than what we would have seen in the past?
I would agree that particularly two chapters, the Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas and the Wetlands chapters, are more restrictive, yes.
Okay. And as Mr. Hovey stated, I'm all for using the best available science, protecting the environment, being good stewards of the environment, but I'm also aware that if we're not careful, we're going to, whether we do it or someone else does it for us, be regulated out of the ability to develop a fairly finite piece of property, which is Woodby Island. I mean, but specifically the city of Oak Harbor. And there's a lot of little ditches. I know we had the folks from Dillard's that showed up probably a couple years ago when we did our shoreline management plan. I think it was the shoreline management plan. We had some updates where there was 200 feet of wherever salt water was detected. I'm trying to remember all the specifics. And it's those instances, and I know there's wording in here possibly for variances that will help us get out of that, but I don't know if I'm entirely ready to support this. In general, the concept of some of the wordsmithing and the definitions make sense, but you were referencing, I think it's page 150 in our packet. Get back to that page. It's 151, I guess it's stamped page 150, but digitally it's, are they the same? I guess they are the same. They're the same 151 and 152. On 150, section 2012.120, the variances, is that what you referenced?
Yes. Well, and the reasonable use exceptions, which did not change, so they're not in the ordinance.
So this second sentence there, I guess, references the hearings examiner shall review the request and make a written finding. So it's not staff, it's not council. That variance would be up to our hearings examiner?
For the variance, yes, that's a different animal than a reasonable use exception, however. And Steve, I don't know if you want to elaborate on the reasonable use exception versus
And that
the
quote,
variance.
yours was a reasonable use exception to prevent a regulatory taking.
So there are degrees of relief available through the code. The first is an administrative one, which is actually, if you want to look at what is the stamped page 157, middle of the page or top 1/3 of the page, the heading is under modifications to buffer widths, and then reducing wetland buffer widths is the language on that page. So that's the first step, right? And so there are things that we do administratively based upon site information, right? So when you learn more about that particular wetland and how it's working on that particular property, there are tools which are available to the applicant to seek a reduction in the width of the buffer, and we have the ability administratively to approve that, assuming that the things are being met. So that's sort of piece number one. If you need to go more substantial than what we can handle out of the administrative reduction process or the buffer width averaging process, then you move up to the variance process, and there are identified standards for that. That's still seeking relief from maybe the number associated with that particular wetland or any other standard that we're talking about. And then the final stage of relief is the reasonable use exception. And that's the one where the applicant makes the case that he or she has lost reasonable economic use of the property because of the imposition of the critical areas regulations on that particular piece of property. That too is a hearing examiner process, predominantly because it's a quasi-judicial process. And you want those findings to be based in a setting of quasi-judicial proceedings rather than at the administrative level or rather than at the legislative level. So sort of three ways in which we start with the rules. We start with the rules that allow us to do things administratively, then we move on to the variances if that's not sufficient, and then finally you end with the reasonable use exceptions.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad you brought that up because I'd highlighted, I guess it's now 4A is where that language starts. The director shall have the authority to reduce the standard buffer widths. Is this in line with what the county is doing? I mean, are they following the same recommendations? Is this in line, or you may or may not know, but their standards as far as wetlands, their planning?
I just recently was transmitted a draft of the ordinance, but I have not had a chance to look at it. They're under the same state requirements through growth management. However, being a county in rural development, they have different issues that they're dealing with. Certainly they have by far more critical areas than we do in the city.
Right.
And they typically have larger buffers than what we do in the urban setting. Because they're in a rural setting, because they lack the intensity of land uses that we have in an urban setting, if you think about it. As a general rule, buffers applied in the rural areas are larger than they are in the urban areas.
Okay. Have we received any negative feedback from developers or builders with regard to the proposed changes?
We have received very little feedback, but no negative feedback.
But if we pass this, we'll receive it tomorrow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, I guess you've already addressed this. I'm just concerned about some of these areas that we've looked at, whether it's an RV park relocation or areas like that might be close to these critical areas that somehow we're going to regulate ourselves out of the possible development of those properties. My, I guess, last comment, and then I'll yield to some of my peers here, is, and I ask this question of you or other staff often, if it's a recommendation from the state, and I think you finally came back and said it was a strong recommendation, in my eyes that's slightly different, or that is different than a mandate. So if we didn't, let's say, change from 200 to 300, we do everything else, but we keep those numbers at 200, and we pass that ordinance, what happens?
Well, according to my conversations with ecology, what would happen is that they would consider that those buffers were not based on best available science, because their recommended buffers are. And that would be where we would stand, and I wouldn't know what the next steps would be.
And maybe, so Mr. Powers, I'll put you on the spot because you've been here a long time. Do we get a nastygram? What happens? What happens?
I think the worst-case scenario is that they challenge the council's adoption of the development regulation. I mean, that's really the worst-case scenario. And whether that vehicle is through a LUPA or some other legal methodology, I think remains to be seen. But there are these push and pulls across the state all of the time. And so that's the potential that you run into. And I think that unlike some things where we can apply our local knowledge and say, well, this is why we think this makes sense in Oak Harbor as opposed to someplace else, is that this, if we were to just have a different number, now that we have the feedback from ecology, it would be difficult for it to be anything other than our arbitrary number. We don't have any science that says to us, in our particular environment, it doesn't need to be X number of feet, it can be Y number of feet. And that's what they would be looking for it to be based upon. It's a much different argument than, say, if we're arguing about densities or if we're arguing about other types of things where maybe we can have a local standard that doesn't have to be based on some identifiable peer-reviewed science. That's the challenging point that we have.
Right.
Again, it happens all over the state in terms of this very conversation. You know, the planning commissions and councils are historically very displeased when we start talking about critical areas codes and specifically wetland buffers. Probably the only thing more displeasurable than that for planning commissions and councils are shoreline regulations. And sometimes we have the misfortune of having both of them in the same environment.
So I'll end with this. I've heard over my time here comments from staff, and specifically as the LID thing cranked back up, and I know that's a separate issue. There were talks that, you know, we tried to go to Olympia, we tried to deal with this, we tried to get some traction, and in the end we were just worn down either financially or physically. We couldn't make headway. And so I pause now and I wonder if it's not better to beg a little bit of forgiveness than to ask permission. And I don't know if that's the right analogy, but in changing this or keeping this at 200 versus 300 and then letting the state come back and say, sorry, you know.
So I offer maybe one comment in that area, and I think we may have made this same comment at the workshop, although I don't recall, which is quite naturally the council has focused on that largest number on that piece of paper, but that is for the Category 1 wetland, of which if we have any, we probably have only one that I am aware of here in the city of Oak Harbor. The vast majority of the wetlands that we deal with are nowhere near a Category 1, and they tend to be at the opposite end of the scale. They tend to be fairly degraded already. And so we are looking at substantially less buffer widths in most of our development situations. And so while it's really natural to look at that number and say, oh my gosh, it went from 200 to 300, the likelihood that we're really dealing with that in the vast majority of our development situations is very, very slim.
Thank you.
Anyone else? So, Councilman Almberg. Yes.
Thank you. I was just waiting to see if I had any other council members who wanted to speak before I took up this time. Yeah.
You have 3 minutes.
Yeah. I can't cover it in 3 minutes. I think Mayor Pro Tem Pagal wanted to say something.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Yeah, thank you. I think it'll be just short. What I'm hearing is the protection of wetland based on this ordinance is standard based on the regulations of the state and Department of Ecology. And yet on page 157 through 160, a buffer on the Category 1 wetland and buffer on Category 2 and 3. It says reducing wetland buffer widths, that the director has the ability or the authority to reduce the buffer widths. So it's not like set in stone when this ordinance is set either 50 weeds or the buffer of 300 feet. So it can be modified based on location or environment of the
Right,
wetland.
and as Steve mentioned, there are some flexibilities in here. The key is the buffer, under number 2, A2, the buffer reduction shall not adversely affect the functions and values of the adjacent wetlands. So somebody's going to have to do some type of an analysis on that buffer reduction proposal to make sure that the functions and values of that wetland are not degraded. But there are options there then.
So the director has the ability to make modifications of the buffer so development will not be very close to the critical areas or wetland.
Right, and we would need some additional best available science on that specific wetland to allow us to do that.
Okay, that's all I have. Pretty short.
Councilor Ellenberg.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. LaFever, can you recite, or do you have at your disposal up there the actual language for the requirement and the timing of this ordinance amendment? Can you read that to me? Do you have it?
Well, I had the RCW, which kind of put this whole thing in motion as far as reviewing and revising development regulations.
But is it mandatory that it's reviewed? I think it's mandatory that it's reviewed at a period of time. What is that period of time?
Well, they're staged throughout the state.
Right.
All the growth management agencies and jurisdictions are required to do this, but they're different time frames.
Right.
For Island County and the cities within Oak Harbor, we were mandated to have that review done by June of 2016.
And I read in here we received a 1-year extension to that.
Yes.
But it doesn't say it has to be revised by that time. It says we have to be reviewed. That's the language that I'm
Well,
looking
and
for.
it says revised if needed, so that's.
If needed?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So that's a little loose there too, correct?
I'm sorry, Mr. Albert, it's really not. I mean, perhaps from your vantage point, but not from the staff vantage point. We have an obligation under state law to review our comprehensive plan and our development regulations and revise if necessary. And we're required to make sure that our comprehensive plan and our development regulations are consistent with the most current version of the Growth Management Act.
Okay. And then this, this term of best available science keeps getting used. I mean, that seems to be the cover story coming out of DOE. Always they have the best available science, and I will challenge that in that just on stormwater. We'll get to stormwater even within critical areas because stormwater management is covered in this critical areas and this ordinance. I'll show you where. But under best available science, the best available science seems to apply to eastern Washington based on rainfall, but it doesn't apply to our area based on rainfall. So do we have different types of science, eastern Washington than western Washington?
Again, at the risk of sounding argumentative, we're mixing apples and oranges here.
But let me make my point, and that's what I'm getting to. This ordinance clearly it doesn't imply, it states that we have to deal with the critical recharge of the aquifers. That's part of stormwater management. That's the whole purpose for LID, stormwater management. And when we go through this ordinance, it references the most current stormwater management system available or ordinance available by DOE or ones that become more current even after that. I mean, it's referred to in this thing. That's what we're adopting tonight. It is tied to stormwater management.
Again, at the risk of sounding argumentative, I don't think that staff believes that it is, Mr. Almberg.
Okay.
The reason is that, yes, while rain plays a role in aquifer recharge, because without rain, you're not going to recharge the aquifer. Without rain, we're not going to have the moisture generally necessary for wetlands. We're not specifically talking about which stormwater regulations apply to the city of Oak Harbor in this critical area code, which is before the council this evening.
Well, I'm going to sound argumentative because I disagree with you on that, because I read it. It's right here. When we adopt this, you can go right to page 141 in this thing, and it's under section 2002, and it refers to aquifers. You go to, what's the other page? You go to 142. We talk about critical aquifer recharge areas under Ordinance 2032-10. I mean, we go through this whole ripple effect of referring to this paragraph, to this section, et cetera. It goes on. We are dealing with stormwater management here, but that's all I'm going to say about stormwater management, because I've made my point anyway for me, maybe not for you. The other reason I am not going to support this tonight for this reason, and it doesn't mean I won't eventually support it, is in page 141 under section 2002, you stated that there are 5 items. We have the general critical areas regulations, we have Oak Harbor tree protection, and we have the wetlands, and we have fish and wildlife, and we have conservation areas. Let's see, we have geology, and then we have critical aquifer recharge. So we're going right back to stormwater again. I said it again. And but the other reason I will not support this tonight is because there has been no change, any modification to our ordinance regarding preservation of oak trees in Oak Harbor. And at our workshop, this was a pretty strong point that was discussed with the public and even within ourselves, that we were going to consider a tree protection plan or some implementation of a stronger oak tree protection plan. It's not included in this. And I'm making a statement. I'm not asking for an answer, and I'm not asking a question. But what I would like to do is make a motion that we postpone a decision here tonight on Ordinance 1801 until our July 26th workshop, where we can have a discussion and take possible action to allow staff to come up with a tree protection plan, which other communities have them. I'll help you out with names of them if you need help with that. And that the other part about the stormwater thing, I think we need to have a discussion, a real solid meeting between DOE and our community regarding this LID thing and what is best management practice relative to rainfall as it relates to our region and eastern Washington. Okay, so I made the motion.
Will you carefully reread that motion?
The motion is that I move to postpone a decision this evening on Ordinance 1801 until July 26th workshop.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion to postpone this decision tonight until the July 26th workshop. So, want to discuss that motion? Yes, Mayor Pro Tem.
Mr. Almberg mentioned on the comment on the motion about protection also of the oak tree. Would that be considered as part of a critical area, or oak trees within the wetland area only?
Yeah, I think we need to...
If I could, Mayor, and Mr. Armberg, I realized you didn't ask for an answer, but again, with due respect, that was a week ago, and Mr. Servadius, I believe, asked the question as to how long it would take for staff to come back with some language to talk to the council about protecting Gary oak trees. We said 90 to 120 days. We thought we could accomplish it. This project has been on a much separate track, but recognizing or having some idea that this question was coming up this evening, I quickly threw together a slide, which I hope will help the council understand the range of possibilities that are before us in terms of how we think about Gary oak standards and where we might put them. At last week's workshop, we heard from City Attorney Esparza, who suggested that maybe trying to put the standards inside of the variance language wasn't going to be the right place. It could very well end up in 2016, but that may not be the only place that you might want to put those protection standards. They may fit very well in the native vegetation section of the code, because we have standards in there already about protecting certain kinds of landscaping and native vegetation when construction is taking place. In fact, there could be another area of the code as well. And so while it is certainly something that staff knows that we need to work for with the council and work with you on that, it was not our expectation that we were asked to bring it back as part of this code 7 days after the workshop. We discussed it this morning at the department head meeting, and we'll be prepared to give a briefing to you at your August workshop to talk more about what the council wishes to achieve with these protection standards. Now, if the council has concerns about the code that you think we can help you with between now and the workshop, we would be glad to do that. We just would really need some direction as to what you think those things are that you want us to suss out for you.
Okay, so we did discuss that, and I was it. So it was the workshop, and what was the staff answer? That did you feel that you would be prepared to have the full discussion at the workshop?
Well, I think what we'd like to do, Mayor, is to really talk about what are the council's preferences in this particular area. Do we want to be very prescriptive in terms of how those standards are? Do we want to have, so in other words, these are the standards, you do this no matter what? Do we want to have some prescriptive standards that apply unless these other circumstances apply? We'd like the opportunity to research some other communities' codes, come back to you with what we think are the best examples out there from other communities, and then get a feel from the council as to how rigid or non-rigid you want to be when we're talking about these very specific types of trees and very specific types of circumstances. And pulling that all together between now and the July workshop will probably be pretty tough. We could certainly be ready to have a robust conversation by the August workshop.
Councilor Umber.
Since we have a motion on the table, we're in the discussion phase right now. Okay, Mr. Powers, part of this ordinance that we're being asked to take action on tonight, under section 2002, the purpose, it refers to the purpose of the city's critical area regulation refers to chapters. It refers to specific items. And I know you've read this because you're part of the author of this thing. Critical area regulations, chapter 2016, oak tree protection. Nothing has changed. And we're talking about possibly doing something about that in the future. But why do we have it in this? Why is there a reference to this? Why is there a reference to the aquifers and stormwater management if that's not what we're really planning to do? Why don't we go back to DOE and say, we're not ready, we're struggling with a couple of things in here that we have to work on. We need a little more time.
Mr. Allenberg, legislative edit technique for 2002-010 would show you the entire paragraph with strike-throughs and underlines for those things which are being modified. So that paragraph is as it is in your code today, with the exception of the cross out of the word sensitive, substituting the word hazardous, and adding chapter 2034 frequently flooded areas. That's sort of answer number one.
There's no change regarding the oak tree.
That's right. Answer number two, sir, is that there are 5 critical areas from a state perspective. The state does not regulate Gary oak trees as a critical area. That's a local choice. The citizens of Oak Harbor and the Council of Oak Harbor have decided to make that a critical area. So from the state's perspective, that's not something that we're obligated to regulate, nor is it part of our obligation.
But this is our ordinance. This is not the state's ordinance. So why can't we have an ordinance that is meaningful, that's enforceable? Why can't we just go back to DOE and say, okay, we recognize your recommendations. We're still struggling with some of this. We're still working on it. Oh, by the way, we still want to talk to you about LID at the same time.
I think I'm struggling to answer your question, sir, because I'm partly hearing a question about oak trees. I'm partly hearing a question about the buffers.
I'm talking about our critical areas ordinance.
Mr. Umberg, I think I've answered the question to the best of my ability.
Yeah, I think if I can, I'd like to jump in here. This particular ordinance itself covers those things in very broad terms like that. I think the real intent, Mr. Alberg, maybe what you're wanting to talk about is to go back to a tree protection plan that you referenced at the workshop. That's a very good thing for us to take a look at, and I think we've given a timeline on that. We can see what we can do to get that sooner if possible. But I think to try to lump all of these things into this one ordinance would not be our recommendation. We can still pass this, move on with the critical areas items, and we could still be working on the LID issue, which is going to take some time. And also we can be working on this with the tree protection plan. We've already looked at a couple cities, Pasadena and Kenmore, Washington are two good ones there, and bring that back when we have really given it a good look and not just reacting really quickly and trying to throw something together would be probably a better recommendation. And we could amend those sections in the code at that time, if that would work for you.
You're asking me that question if that works
I
for
am.
me? No, it
It's
doesn't work
rhetorical
for me
somewhat,
because I do not want to vote for this ordinance until we have actually asked DOE for additional time so we can solve, let's say they're not going to solve the oak tree thing, that's our personal thing, but until we solve this issue about best available science and how that applies to Western Washington differently than Eastern Washington, which affects us by easily the $15,000 to $30,000 per single-family residential lot. That's a lot of money, and if we don't make it urgent with them, it's just going to keep sliding and sliding. We'll be talking about this in 2 years, I bet. Okay.
Councilor Heisen?
Mayor, I'd like to call the question.
Okay, so we have one other council person that hasn't spoken.
I just wanted to say that I think what I'm hearing about the best available science, specifically to this critical areas ordinance, for me as a council member in the city, and what I'm hearing maybe too, and what I'm processing is that there's sort of a loss of a local control over what our engineers and what our experts are thinking is the best science for our area. That's the part that I struggle with as a council member the most, and I see we have hired some very talented planners, engineers that we have as a city, and it kind of bothers me that you all aren't able to say, this is our area's rainfall, this is our area's land, this is how our area works as far as these wetlands and wildlife, and we can look and see what wildlife we have. So that all part. So I'm wondering with this best available science, if there's a way to look at other areas that are similar to our geography, climate, land, to collaborate with them, or if they have done their own best available science. And this is in the future. I know this can't be done right now. I mean, I know you can't do that and make that happen before we're probably going to be under the gun for this. But has anybody talked about that or thought about looking at other environmental areas? Like, don't look at statewide. Look at our specific type of area. Is there any way to collaborate with that to help us come up with our own expertise, your own thoughts, your own engineering minds of what is best for us, so that we can say to the DOE, from what I'm hearing, is if we were able to say to the DOE, this is our area and this is what works for us, to make that happen.
Great question. We were able to do that with our Shoreline Master Program because before we started our effort, the county went through a very exhaustive study of shoreline environments, entire Island County, not just the unincorporated portions. And we were able to piggyback off of that information when our consultants helped us then prepare our Shoreline Master Program. So there was a great example where we worked with another jurisdiction and local scientific data that helped craft our regulations, and we were successful in our conversations with ecology. We don't have a similar situation where we're talking about best available science as it applies to wetland buffers that we can draw from. But we have done that in the past, and that's a perfectly acceptable methodology. And as you might expect, the state has a fairly lengthy list of things that in terms of how do you determine what best available science is.
I'm sure they do.
Yeah. So again, yes, we've done that successfully in the past.
So we have a motion. A call for the question.
Point of order, Mayor.
Yes.
Calling for the question doesn't necessarily stop debate. I think
Okay.
we have to vote.
Okay.
If we're going to stop debate.
Okay. How would yes, Councilor Zerbe.
I just wanted to comment, and just good education, I guess, for all of us in the public. I seconded Mr. Allenberg's motion because I wanted to have some more discussion on that particular point. And maybe I'm cheating here and piggybacking off that, but I'd almost rather postpone this for a different reason than Mr. Allenberg, but I would support that if it accomplished that goal, rather than voting no on the main motion if it comes forward based on staff's recommendation. I had a couple of questions. Mr. Allenberg commented a lot on the LID, and I know they're separate, but page 154, and whenever we quote stuff, if we could all state the page number so we can all find it. But page 154, specifically 2E6, is an example of where it will reference all regulations regarding stormwater and wetland management are followed, including but not limited to local, state, and, whoops, sorry, on the right one there. Sorry, just below that. Stormwater LID, they keep referencing the LID best management practices. So there is some merit there to that discussion, and I understand that we're looking at two separate animals here. My concern, and I think Councilmember Wassinger was a little more eloquent in stating that I feel like we're giving up a lot of control here locally, and we've kind of lost the battle on that one to some degree.
So that inclusion there is because you can have stormwater treatment facilities inside of a wetland buffer. That's what that whole section is leading you to. And so we had similar language in our existing code, and that applied under the 2005 manual as well. And so that's where, and perhaps I've not been particularly articulate in trying to respond to the council's questions and concerns. Stormwater is inside of this thing because we often have to talk about trying to do more than one thing in the same space. And so it's not reasonable, and it would be completely onerous for a piece of property, some of Mr. Hovey's concerns, to say on this piece of property we're going to have a critical area, now we're going to have we're going to have stormwater things, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, so you don't have much left over to develop. And so we get to accomplish more than one thing in the same space at times. And you can have stormwater facilities inside of a wetland buffer if you do it in an appropriate fashion. So that's not new concept. That's something that's been in our code since this code came into being in its present form, which is 2005. And we had the old manual that we applied in there. Yes, we understand at the staff level that and we're not happy about the new manual either. I think we've been very, very clear about that. But all this is really saying is you will still get to do stormwater facilities inside of a wetland buffer following the appropriate rules. And we can argue about what the rules are with the state, but this is just saying that we get to do more than one thing in the same space.
Okay. And the next question, which I was going to ask regardless, before Mr. Allenberg made that motion, on page 157, 4A, and then all the provideds that the following apply. Mr. McGow asked this question, so the first one, 4A1, the buffer of a Category 1 wetland shall not be reduced, period. And you said earlier you could possibly only think of one. What is a Category 1 wetland? Give me an example, please.
The only thing that we've ever had close to that is what's referred to as the Northeast 7th Avenue wetland, but that was based on only reconnaissance level work and not actual wetland delineations.
So the square footage of the wetland, what?
It's the characteristics, the components of it, the open water feature versus this particular type of plant life versus whether or not is it a wooded wetland? Does it have trees as part of the wetland? So it's a whole list of things that help determine the functions and values as to whether or not it has the highest level of wetland value to the environment, or is it a much lower value. And the only one that has ever come close to that I am aware of is portions of the Northeast 7th Avenue wetland.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Councilor Olmert.
Are we still in discussion here? And,
We are.
you know, there's a lot of, this is probably the most in-depth conversation that we've had about this, even including the workshop, and therefore I'm still inclined to want to go with the motion before us right now to discuss this in depth and give all of us a little more time to really dig into this before we make a final decision.
So, anyone else?
Yeah.
Anyone else? So we have a motion, and I'm going to ask Nikki to save my life again and read the motion.
Mayor Severance, Councilmember Allenberg made a motion to postpone the decision on ordinance number 1801 till the July 26th workshop. The motion was seconded by Councilmember Servadius.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
So let me see. We have, okay. All opposed, say. Okay, so we've got 4-2. And at this point, I guess that obviously we won't have any more discussion about this tonight, except I guess I have a concern about what staff needs to be ready to do at that workshop. We have a fairly busy schedule already at that workshop. So
We do, but I can make some calls and find out what things specifically we want to put on the agenda for this item there, so we can be really efficient about that time on there.
Okay.
So we have some notes as far as what things need to be addressed there. At least we can develop our input for that and bring that up at the workshop then.
Okay. Any other? Okay, we'll lively discussion there. Thank you to all.
Thank you, Council.
We are now on our final item for tonight, item number 7, ordinance number 1806, amendment to Oak Harbor Municipal Code 2.02, Salary Commission, and we have our city administrator, Dr. Merriman.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council. This agenda bill is bringing forward the edits to our municipal code for our salary commission. This 1806 will amend Chapter 2.02 on the Salary Commission, and there are 4 bullet points really that summarize what those changes are. These are on the bottom of the agenda bill for this item here. So the commission, what we're doing, we're going from 7 members to 5. That's item 1. We have the requirement, this came out of a little bit of discussion before, whether we wanted someone to be a city resident or not. And so the midpoint that we came up with is we'll have not less than 3 shall be residents of Oak Harbor. The other 2 may be owners of businesses located within the city. This opens up where there might be individuals who don't actually live within the city, but they do have an economic or business interest in the city itself. Item 3 is a member would serve a 6-year term without compensation rather than the 3 years he did. Maybe one item to add on this, there isn't a term limit. I believe in our previous code, people could be on the salary commission for 2 terms, and that was the limit on it. That has been struck out of this item. And finally, you have 3 members of the commission shall be the quorum, as it's stated there. So our recommended action for City Council tonight is to adopt these code changes using Ordinance 1806.
Thank you, Dr. Merriman. I guess before we bring that to council, I'd like to see if we have any interested people here that would like to speak to that. Doesn't look like it. Okay. Okay. City Council, yes, Councilor Wassinger.
Thank you so much for bringing this back and adding the residency requirements that I had questions about last council meeting. I did have one more. So the state RCW says in their section that they may not be appointed to more than 2 terms. But in the bullet point, it says, let me see here. Oh, a member of the commission shall serve for a 6-year term without compensation as opposed to a 3-year term. Did I just hear you say, though, that there was not a term limit, or was that you just?
I did say that, and that was
Oh,
going off
okay.
of bullet 4, right underneath that
Okay.
one. And you'll see the line that says, no member of the commission shall be appointed to more than 2 terms.
Oh, okay.
And that's being struck out on there.
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you.
Sure.
That's all. Thank you.
Anyone else? Council?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Councilor Heisman?
I guess I just have a comment. I just want to thank Councilmember Wassinger for bringing this up. I think catching that residency requirement was a really good catch when that was on the consent agenda. So that's important. So thank you.
How would the council like to proceed? Yes, Councilor Servadius.
Thank you. Thank you. I move to adopt ordinance number 1806, amending Oak Harbor Municipal Code, Chapter 2.02, entitled Salary Commission.
Second.
So we've got a motion to adopt ordinance number 1806, amending Oak Harbor Municipal Code, Chapter 2.02, entitled Salary Commission. I'm going to give the motion to Servadius. That was obvious, and I'll give the second to Munns. So we've got a motion second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Passes unanimously. And with that, I think we are out of business to discuss, and therefore we're adjourned.